Senator Gary Peters just asked the Postmaster General a simple question. Under what legal authority can the Postal Service regulate who and how people can vote by mail? The answer was stunning. The Postmaster General said he used to be a lawyer, but not a constitutional lawyer. He said he would defer to the courts. He could not name a single law. He could not cite a single constitutional provision. He had nothing.
As to the authority, I used to be a lawyer, but I was a business lawyer, not a constitutional lawyer. And so I would have to defer that to the courts to understand the authority.
Peters said the Constitution is clear. Elections belong to the states. The federal government has no role. He said this is a power grab. He said it is dangerous. He said it is unacceptable. The Postal Service is supposed to deliver mail, not decide who gets to vote. Let's watch.
Proposed vote by mail rule published on June 2nd at the direction of the President, as I mentioned in my opening comments, I believe should concern every American. This rule marks certainly an alarming departure from the Postal Service's long-standing tradition of neutrally delivering all types of mail. You get a piece of mail with an address on it, you make sure it gets delivered to that address in a timely fashion. You don't ask any other questions. What this basically rule will do is going to turn the Postal Service, however, into a ballot verification agency that's would control basically a master database of every American absentee voter. It would also give the Postal Service new power to determine whose ballots get delivered. I think the Constitution is clear. Elections are to be administered by the states, not the federal government. We have a tradition of our local communities and states administering these elections. And once again, not the federal government. So my question for you is, under what legal authority can the Postal Service regulate who and how people can vote by mail?
Yeah, as you know, our regulations are proposed regulations, not final regulations. As to the authority, I used to be a lawyer, but I was a business lawyer, not a constitutional lawyer. And so I would have to defer that to the courts to understand the authority.
Well, I think it's clear that there's nowhere in the Constitution, there's no federal law that the Postal Service is authorized to create these types of voter databases, ballot verification systems, or mandatory standards. It just simply doesn't exist. It's hard to interpret a law when it doesn't even exist there, which is what we have. Just because President Trump wants to do this does not make it law, doesn't make it right, doesn't make it constitutional. There is certainly a massive difference between general mail requirements and regulating elections. Routine changes to the postal network can have a small impact on election mail, but this effort is a power grab to swap constitutionally mandated state control for what the president wants. I think it's very clear. So last year, Mr. Steiner, you issued a rule that explicitly said that the Postal Service has, quote, no role in administering elections. What has changed?
I don't think anything has changed. Senator, I'm not a political person, and the Postal Service is not a political organization. We, as you said, I think you quite aptly said, we deliver mail. That's what we do. We deliver mail. And that's what ballots are. Ballots are mail. Now, they are a special kind of mail, obviously. They need special care. And so years ago, we recommended what we call Kit 600. In Kit 600, the fundamental premises of Kit 600 is a unique barcode and a unique envelope. That allows us to move those ballots more efficiently, more securely. That is what our proposed rules suggest, is that we have unique barcode, unique envelope. And that is not something that is new. That's something that's been being used by states throughout the country on both sides of the political spectrum. So California has followed it, Oregon has followed it, Arizona has followed it, Florida has followed it, among many other states. And so, to me, it's not a political question. It's a question of how do we most efficiently and securely move ballots. We've been recommending this for many years. All this does is make it a requirement.
Well, certainly best practices are different than having a mandatory requirement. You could follow best practices to deliver it more efficiently without having control of vast voter rolls and having the ability to have that data. This is basically a backdoor way for the federal government to get voting information that states control under the U.S. Constitution. So yes or no, if a state refuses to turn their absentee voter list over to the federal government, will the Postal Service still mail their ballots under this proposal rule?
Under our proposed regulation, no. We would tell the state that we need the manifest in order to, look, what we're asking
So, I
for.
mean, that's the answer. You would tell no. So the proposed rule basically coerces states to conform to these new requirements and hand over their absentee voter rolls or face the consequences of not being able to vote by mail. Some states, that's all they do. Oregon is completely vote by mail. If they say, no, we control the list, the states control the list, we're not going to give it.
Oregon has followed Kit 600 since the day they started voting by mail.
This is a different issue. This will be a lot different issue. You're telling these states either give the federal government this information, trust the federal government, trust the Trump administration. We'll take good care of these. And if you don't do it, you can't mail absentee ballots. You're going to make a decision that people cannot vote by mail. That's unacceptable.
Well,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
all that does, Senator, is make sure that we match the ballots that a state believes they're sending out to what actually gets sent out, right? And so all the state gives us is a list of here are the voters that are supposed to get ballots and here are the ballots. We then compare the two, make sure that the ballots that are supposed to be sent get sent. If Maryland had followed that, they probably wouldn't be in the problem they're in today. So it is a much more efficient, a much more effective way to make sure that states, I would think that states would want the information to ensure that the ballots that they think are sending out are the ballots that are actually being sent out.
Well, they do know what they're dropping mail. I think they can understand that. They think if they put an address with their voter rolls on a piece of mail for a ballot and give it to you, they do expect you're actually going to deliver it. You don't have to say, we want all of your information. We want that information in our control. You mentioned Maryland. I think that was a printing error. This regulation wouldn't have done nothing to fix what happened in Maryland. The states control their own elections. That's pretty clear in the Constitution. And an effort by this administration to nationalize elections and have the federal government having this information is incredibly dangerous precedent. You can imagine sharing this information with the Department of Homeland Security and using these lists for a variety of nefarious purposes. We need to protect the integrity of the voting rolls. We need to protect the separation of elections from federal government and ensure that our state and local governments are the one administering their own elections. That's what this is about.
Senator Gary Peters just delivered a masterclass in how to expose executive overreach and constitutional evasion. He did not come with a speech. He came with questions. He came with facts. He came with the Constitution. And he left no doubt about the answer. The exchange between Senator Peters and the Postmaster General was not just a routine oversight hearing. It was a constitutional confrontation about the very nature of American democracy. At stake was a fundamental question. Who controls elections in the United States? Peters began by laying out the stakes. He said the proposed rule marks an alarming departure from the Postal Service's tradition of neutrally delivering all types of mail. He said the rule would turn the Postal Service into a ballot verification agency. It would give the Postal Service control of a master database of every American absentee voter. It would give the Postal Service new power to determine whose ballots get delivered. He said the Constitution is clear. Elections are to be administered by the states, not the federal government. Then he asked the question, under what legal authority can the Postal Service regulate who and how people can vote by mail? The Postmaster General's answer was stunning. He said he used to be a lawyer, but he was a business lawyer, not a constitutional lawyer. He said he would defer to the courts. He could not name a single law. He could not cite a single constitutional provision. He had nothing. Peters said it is clear that there is no federal law authorizing this. He said just because President Trump wants to do this does not make it law. He said this is a power grab. He said it is dangerous. He said it is unacceptable. The Postmaster General's admission that he could not identify the legal authority for the proposed rule was a remarkable moment. The head of a federal agency was proposing a rule that would fundamentally change the relationship between the federal government and elections, and he could not say where the authority came from. That is not how a functioning democracy operates. Peters then pressed on the coercion. He asked if the Postal Service would still mail ballots if a state refused to turn over its absentee voter list. The Postmaster General said no. He said the state would need to provide a manifest. That is coercion. That is a requirement. That is a threat. Give us your voter information, or your citizens cannot vote by mail. Peters called it unacceptable. He was right. The Postal Service is supposed to deliver mail. It is not supposed to condition delivery on the surrender of state-controlled voter information. The Constitution assigns election administration to the states. The Postal Service does not have the authority to override that. But the proposed rule would do exactly that. It would create a federal mandate that states hand over their voter rolls or lose the ability to vote by mail. That is not a best practice. That is a power grab. The Postmaster General tried to defend the proposal. He said Kit 600 is a best practice. He said unique barcodes and unique envelopes help move ballots efficiently. He said states like California, Oregon, Arizona, and Florida have followed it. Peters pushed back. He said best practices are different from mandatory requirements. He said states can follow best practices without handing over control of their voter rolls. He said, this is a backdoor way for the federal government to get voting information that states control under the Constitution. The distinction between voluntary best practices and mandatory federal requirements is crucial. A state can choose to implement a barcode system to improve efficiency. That is a policy decision. That is not the same as being forced to hand over its entire voter database to the federal government under threat of having its ballots delayed. Peters understood that distinction. The Postmaster General did not. Peters then pointed to the irony of the Maryland example. The Postmaster General had mentioned Maryland as a state that could have benefited from the proposed rule. He said Maryland had a printing error that caused problems with ballots. Peters said the proposed regulation would not have fixed that. He said a printing error is a printing error. It has nothing to do with barcodes or manifests. The Postmaster General had no response. The Maryland example was a distraction. It was an attempt to justify a power grab with a problem that the regulation would not have solved. Peters saw through it. Peters then warned about the precedent. He said you can imagine sharing this information with the Department of Homeland Security. He said you can imagine using these lists for a variety of nefarious purposes. He said we need to protect the integrity of the voting rolls. He was right. The administration has already shown it is willing to use federal power for political purposes. It has already shown it is willing to target its political enemies. It has already shown it is willing to weaponize the government. Giving it control of voter information is a recipe for disaster. The hearing ended without the Postmaster General offering a meaningful defense. He sat there. He listened. He deflected. He could not name a single law. He could not cite a single constitutional provision. He had nothing. Peters had done his job. He had held him accountable. He had exposed the truth. And he had made it clear that the American people deserve better. The question now is whether anyone in the administration is listening. The Postal Service is supposed to deliver mail, not decide who gets to vote. That is not a political opinion. That is the Constitution. The debate over this rule is not just about the Postal Service. It is about the broader question of federal power over elections. The Constitution gives states the authority to administer elections. The federal government has a role in protecting voting rights, but it does not have the authority to take over state election systems. The proposed rule would do exactly that. It would require states to hand over their voter rolls to the federal government. It would require states to use a federal barcode system. It would require states to follow federal rules for ballot delivery. That is not a partnership. That is a takeover. Peters called it a power grab. He was right. The administration is using the Postal Service to nationalize elections. It is using the Postal Service to collect voter information. It is using the Postal Service to create a federal database of absentee voters. That is not what the Postal Service was created to do. The Postal Service was created to deliver mail. It was not created to regulate elections. It was not created to manage voter data. It was not created to decide who gets to vote. The implications of this rule are profound. If the federal government can require states to hand over voter information, what else can it require? If the federal government can condition ballot delivery on state compliance, what else can it condition? The precedent is dangerous. The rule is a threat to state sovereignty. It is a threat to the separation of powers. It is a threat to the integrity of elections. Peters understood that. He said it clearly. He said we need to protect the integrity of the voting rolls. He was right.